A widow, a harbour, and fog hiding more than shadows. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I'm your host, Silas Wren. Tell me where you're watching from. It always makes this journey richer. Now let's begin. The fog had rolled in early that evening, thick and damp, the kind that clung to one's coat and blurred the lamps along the Boulevard Saint-Germain into pale yellow stains. Maigret stood in his usual corner of the café, his heavy frame bent slightly forward over a glass of beer that had gone flat, though he hadn't noticed. He had been sitting there longer than he intended, savouring the warmth, the smell of tobacco. Smoke mingled with coffee grounds, the muffled talk of clerks and students. It was not a night for work. It was the sort of evening that tempted one to linger in the familiar comfort of routine. A pipe, a walk home, perhaps Madame Maigret waiting, with supper kept warm on the stove. He imagined her glancing at the clock in the kitchen, not worried but simply resigned to the rhythm of her husband's profession. The telephone on the café counter rang once, startlingly loud in the hush of fog-muted Paris. The waiter lifted. It, with a weary shrug, spoke briefly, then looked toward Maigret. "Chief Inspector for you." Maigret sighed, put down his untouched beer, and moved with the heaviness of a man who had long since surrendered the illusion of free evenings. He pressed the receiver to his ear, saying nothing at first. The voice belonged to Inspector Lognon, always sounding aggrieved, as though life itself had conspired against him. "There's been an incident down by the harbour, Quai de la Tournelle. Her woman, a widow, they say, found wandering in the fog, refusing to speak. Neighbours called it in." Maigret's eyebrows knitted slightly. Not a crime, not yet, just a woman in the fog. But he knew the tone in Lognon's voice, annoyance, unease. Something about it did not fit into the usual reports of drunks, vagrants, or quarrels among neighbours. "I'll come," Maigret said, simply, and replaced the receiver. As he stepped into the fog-dampened street, he paused to fill his pipe, cupping the match against the mist that immediately tried to smother the flame. The sound of the Seine was close, muffled but insistent, a rhythm beneath the silence of the city. It was not the urgency of the call that drew him, but a faint stirring of curiosity. Why had the widow been wandering in the fog without speaking? Fear? Shock? Or something less easy to name? Pulling his collar high against the damp, Maigret began the slow walk toward the river, the fog swallowing his shape until he was no more than another shadow among many. The fog was thicker by the time. Maigret reached the Quai de la Tournelle. His shoes struck against the wet cobblestones, with a sound that seemed oddly amplified in the stillness, as if the mist itself was listening. From a distance he could make out the orange glow of a street lamp, haloed and indistinct, and two uniformed constables standing with their hands deep in their pockets. Between them, hunched against the stone parapet overlooking the river, was the figure of a woman. Lognon was there too, shifting from one foot to the other, with the eternal expression of a man burdened by the world's indifference to his suffering. He greeted Maigret with a curt nod, pulling his coat tighter around his narrow frame. "She hasn't said a word," Lognon muttered, his tone carrying equal measures of irritation and unease. "We found her wandering along the quay. Neighbours said she lives nearby, but they don't know much more. A widow, they think, Madame Serre." Maigret studied the woman quietly, without moving closer at first. She was perhaps in her late 50s, though the fog softened the outline of her face, making it difficult to be sure. She wore a dark wool coat, buttoned unevenly, and a scarf wound too tightly around her neck. Her gloved hands were clutched in front of her, fingers twitching slightly, as if she were counting beads that were not there. "Did she resist?" Maigret asked after a moment, his eyes never leaving her. "No, she just stopped walking when we spoke to her. Like she was waiting for something," Lognon replied. The inspector approached her slowly, not with authority, but with the heaviness of someone accustomed to human silences. He stopped a meter away, his broad figure looming but not threatening. For a moment neither spoke, the fog thickening around them, muffling the distant sound of water lapping against stone. Finally Maigret said, in a voice closer to a murmur than a question, "It's cold tonight." The woman blinked once, slowly, but her gaze remained fixed on the river below. "You live near here," Maigret continued. He knew better than to press, to force. People spoke in their own time, if they spoke at all. His pipe rested unlit between, his teeth, more habit than need. After a long pause, her lips moved. The words came low, almost carried away by the mist. "I don't want to go back there." "Back where, madame?" She shook her head faintly, a gesture that might have been denial or refusal, or simply confusion. Lognon shifted impatiently, but Maigret lifted a hand for silence. He leaned his elbows on the parapet, as though he were merely sharing the view of the river with her. The water was a black smear below, flowing steady and indifferent. "You've been walking a long time?" he asked. "Yes." Her voice was clearer now, though still small. Since before the bells rang." "Which bells?" She hesitated. "Saint Nicolas. For vespers." That meant she had been out for hours, wandering in the fog. Something had driven her from the warmth of her home, something she could not yet name. Maigret sensed the tremor in her tone. Not fear exactly, but a sort of weary resistance. He straightened and turned to Lognon. "Let's take her home. Not the station. Home," Lognon frowned. "But no charges, no crime," Maigret said softly. "Just a walk in the fog. She'll be more herself there." The widow did not protest as they guided her through the narrow streets leading off the quay. Her steps were small but steady, her silence unbroken except for the occasional sigh. The houses in this quarter were modest, many of them leaning as though tired of standing, with worn shutters and narrow doorways. At last, she stopped before a pale blue door set between two shuttered shops. "This is it," she whispered. Inside, the apartment smelled faintly of coal dust and lavender soap. The furniture was sparse, functional and old, though kept with care. A small lamp burned on a side table, its glow failing to banish the shadows that clung to the corners. On the mantel above the fireplace stood a row of framed photographs. A stern man in uniform, a young woman with a baby in her arms, a family group frozen in smiles that seemed too practiced. Maigret's eyes moved over the details without comment. He noticed the absence of recent photographs, the lack of clutter that usually betrayed daily life. It was as if the place had been prepared for inspection, yet not lived in fully. The widow sank into a chair by the fireplace, her gloved hands still clasped. She looked smaller there, diminished by the room around her. "You don't want to be here?" Maigret said gently, not as an accusation but as a recognition. She looked up at him sharply, then away again. "It's too quiet. Since Henri died, it's been too quiet." Her husband. The man in uniform, Maigret guessed. Perhaps a sailor, perhaps something else. "You live alone now?" "Yes." She hesitated, her mouth tightening. "Except for the border?" Maigret caught the flicker in her tone, distaste, reluctance, a detail dropped not by mistake but because silence had become too heavy. He did not pursue it yet. Instead, he moved to the window, pulling aside the curtain. The fog pressed against the glass as though eager to come inside. Somewhere beyond, a ship's horn moaned low and distant. "Would you like us to leave you for the night?" he asked finally. Her answer came too quickly. "No." The word hung in the air, stark and bare. Lognon shot Maigret a look, perplexed. Maigret drew on his unlit pipe, weighing her response. The widow did not want to be left alone. She had fled her apartment, not to escape the cold or the emptiness, but something else entirely. He turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "We'll stay a little longer then. Tell me about your border." Her eyes flickered again, betraying something beneath the calm surface. For the first time since the quay, she seemed uncertain whether to remain silent or to speak, and in that hesitation, Maigret felt it, the first real scent of something amiss not yet defined, but present all the same, like smoke before a fire. The widow's lips parted as though she meant to answer, then closed again. Her fingers twisted the edge of her gloves, worrying at the seams until the leather squeaked softly in the stillness. Maigret remained standing by the window, saying nothing, his heavy presence filling the room without pressing. He knew the silence would weigh on her far more than questions. Finally, in a tone that was almost apologetic, she said, "His name is Le Guen, Jules Le Guen. He came after Henri passed. A friend of a cousin or so, he claimed. He needed a room. The extra money was welcome at the time. Maigret gave a small nod, as though the information were as ordinary as mentioning a milkman. And he still lives here? Yes. He keeps mostly to himself. Works odd hours, I think. Comes and goes at night, I don't ask. The faintest edge of unease clung to her words, something Maigret caught, though she tried to smooth it away. He filled his pipe with deliberate care, tamping the tobacco with a practiced thumb, though he still made no effort to light it. And tonight? His voice was low, measured. Was he here when you left? She froze at the question, eyes dropping to her clasped hands. No, she said finally. At least, I don't think so. I didn't see him. Lognon, who had been shifting restlessly by the door, broke in with his usual impatience. We can send a man to check the registry, find out who this fellow is. Likely nothing. A lodger, that's all. Maigret turned his head slowly, the pipe still between his teeth. Perhaps? His gaze returned to the widow. But something made you walk out into the fog tonight, madame. Something that kept you from wanting to return. Her throat moved as she swallowed, the sound small but audible in the close room. Then she gave a short, brittle laugh. You make it sound as if I were frightened. Were you? The silence stretched. She stared at the fire that had long since gone out, at the grate filled with grey ash. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, frayed at the edges. Sometimes at night I hear him. His door opening, steps on the stairs. I tell myself it's nothing, that I'm imagining things. But tonight, she trailed off, pressing a hand to her temple. Tonight it felt different, as if someone were moving about when they ought not to be. I didn't want to see him. I didn't want to ask. Maigret studied her closely, the weight of his gaze more probing than any direct question. He was not yet convinced whether her unease came from genuine fear or from loneliness twisting ordinary sounds into spectres. He had seen both before. Where? Is his room? She gestured vaguely toward the back of the apartment. At the end of the corridor. I never go in. Lognon gave a sniff. Shall I take a look? Later, Maigret said quietly. He drew the curtains more tightly against the fog, pressing at the glass. For now let Madame rest. We'll not ransack her home in the middle of the night. The widow looked at him then, truly looked, as though uncertain whether to be grateful or more unsettled. He offered her the faintest hint of a smile, one corner of his mouth lifting. We'll speak again in the morning. She nodded, her shoulders relaxing just a little, though the unease never fully left her eyes. When they stepped back into the street, the fog seemed even denser, curling like smoke between the lamp-posts. Lognon exhaled sharply, muttering under his breath. You coddle them, Chief. A boarder comes and goes at odd hours. It's nothing unusual. We waste time. Maigret placed the stem of his pipe firmly between his teeth, ignoring the complaint. His gaze wandered up toward the looming shapes of the buildings along the quay, their windows dark, their outlines softened by the mist. Somewhere, among them was a man named Jules Le Guen, and a widow too uneasy to stay in her own home. That was enough for now. They walked together until the corner where Lognon turned off, grumbling about reports to file. Maigret continued alone, his pace slower, his thoughts circling the evening like the fog around the lamps. The widow's face lingered in his mind, not terrified, not hysterical, but lined with the tension of someone carrying a burden she dared not name. He had seen that expression before in different guises. He stopped before a tobacco shop still faintly lit inside, bought a packet without a word, and exchanged a nod with the shopkeeper. The small gestures, the simple rhythms of life, they grounded him. And yet even here, with the smell of cured leaves in the air, the sense of unease clung. By the time he reached his own apartment, it was past midnight. Madame Maigret was awake, seated neatly at the table with her knitting, as if she had expected his late return. She glanced up only briefly, her expression calm, her questions unspoken. Cold night, he murmured, setting his hat on the rack. She nodded, slipping her needle through another row of stitches. There's stew on the stove. You'll want some. The warmth of the small kitchen wrapped around him as he ladled the thick broth into a bowl. He ate slowly, aware of his wife's quiet presence. the way she never pressed him for details, only listened when he chose to speak. There was a woman, he said after a while, a widow out in the fog by the quay. She didn't want to go back home. Madame Maigret looked at him thoughtfully, her hands pausing in their work. Not wanting to go home can mean many things. Yes, Maigret said, stirring his stew absently. That's what troubles me. The remark hung between them, simple, weighty. Later, when he climbed into bed, he lay awake listening to the muted city noises beyond the fog. A cart rolling over cobbles, the low horn of a distant boat, the faint drip of rainwater from eaves. His mind returned again and again to the widow's words, to the quick tension in her voice when she spoke of her boarder. He did not yet know whether it was fear, guilt, or some other shade of unease that had driven her into the night. But he felt it in his bones. This was no ordinary matter of a lonely woman imagining ghosts in her hallway. Something lay beneath the surface, quiet and patient, waiting for the right moment to rise. By dawn, when he rose to dress for the day, his resolve was set. He would return to the harbour. He would wait and watch and let the silence tell him what words could not. The morning broke with a pale grey light that did little to lift the fog from the streets. It clung stubbornly to the rooftops, settling along the embankments of the Seine like a veil that refused to be lifted. Maigret, his heavy coat buttoned against the chill, left his apartment earlier than usual. Madame Maigret had packed him a small breakfast roll in paper, but he carried it untouched in his pocket, preferring the ritual of his first pipe as he walked. The city at that hour was muted, delivery carts creaking on damp wheels, the sharp bark of a dog echoing in a courtyard, shopkeepers unlatching shutters with tired hands. Maigret absorbed it all in silence, letting the ordinary rhythms of Paris settle into him before turning toward the quay. When he reached the pale blue door of the widow's house, a uniformed officer was already stationed there, stamping his feet against the cold. He straightened at Maigret's approach. "She's awake, sir, made coffee even, said she expected you." Maigret nodded, stepping inside without ceremony. The apartment felt different in the daylight. The same modest furnishings, the same tidy mantel with its row of photographs, but stripped of the shadows that had given it unease the night before. Even so, there was a stiffness in the air, as though the rooms themselves were waiting for something. Madame Serre was seated at the small table, a cup of black coffee untouched before her. She wore the same wool coat, though unbuttoned now, and her scarf lay folded neatly by her side. Her eyes were clearer than they had been in the fog, but there was still a faint tremor in her fingers when she lifted the cup at last and set it down again without drinking. "You came back," she said, almost as if surprised. "I told you I would." Maigret lowered himself into the chair opposite her, filling the space with his bulk but not crowding her. He lit his pipe this time, letting the smoke curl slowly upward. She watched it rise, her lips pressing together. "It must have seemed foolish to you, wandering out into the night like that." "Not foolish," Maigret said, his voice calm, steady. "Something troubled you, enough that you could not stay here." She exhaled, a sound between a sigh and a laugh. "I suppose I wanted someone to notice." Maigret tilted his head slightly. "Not everyone wants to be noticed." "No," she agreed softly. "But I did." He let the silence grow again, the way one might allow a plant to reach toward the sun on its own. Finally she said, "Le Guen hasn't come back. Not since yesterday evening." Maigret nodded. "Does he often stay away overnight?" "Sometimes. He says he works at the docks, but I've never asked which ones. He pays his rent in cash, on time, that is all." Her words were brisk, but Maigret detected the unease beneath them. The absence of detail was itself telling. People who lived together, even as strangers, usually knew more. He leaned back, pipe stem resting against his teeth. "Would you mind if I looked at his room?" She hesitated only a moment before rising. "It's down the corridor." The passage was narrow, its wallpaper faded to a dull yellow. At the end, she opened a door with a small brass key. The room was plain, a narrow bed neatly made, a wooden wardrobe, a table with a lamp. Yet there was a sense of impermanence, as though the man who lived here never intended to stay long. Maigret's eyes lingered on small details. There a pair of heavy boots by the bed, their soles worn smooth from long walking, a jacket thrown across the chair, smelling faintly of tobacco and damp rope. On the table, a box of matches from a cafe across the river, one not in this neighborhood. He touched nothing, merely looked, the way one might absorb the mood of a place rather than its inventory. Then he stepped back into the corridor. "Does he have visitors?" he asked as they returned to the sitting room. "Never." "Letters? Packages?" "Not that I've seen." She clasped her hands, twisting them again. That nervous tic Maigret had noted before. Her eyes searched his face as if hoping he might explain her own unease to her. "You think I've imagined it," she said suddenly. "No." Maigret shook his head slowly. "I think you've noticed something without realizing it, and it unsettles you." Her gaze fell and she whispered, "Perhaps." He let the matter rest for the moment. Rising, he adjusted his coat. "I'll speak to some people along the quay, dock workers, cafe owners, see if they know your border." She did not stop him, but as he reached the door, she said almost reluctantly, "Inspector, he isn't a bad man. He's polite, quiet. But there's something. When he looks at me, it's as though he knows I'm afraid." Maigret paused, studying her for a moment. Then he inclined his head and stepped into the fog-bound street once more. The day wore on as he made his way through the harbour quarter. He stopped at the cafe from which the matchbox had come, a dim establishment with stained curtains and the sour smell of spilled beer. The patron, a broad woman with a sharp tongue, recognized the name at once. Le Guen, tall fellow, dark, hair going thin. He comes in now and then, doesn't drink much, just sits and smokes, listens more than he talks. Some say he used to work on the river barges, though I've never seen him with the boatmen. "Does he meet anyone here?" Maigret asked. She shrugged. "Not that I've noticed. Always alone." Alone. The word followed Maigret as he stepped back into the grey afternoon. A solitary man lodging in a widow's house, appearing and disappearing without pattern, leaving unease in his wake. No crime yet. No evidence of anything at all. But the smell of something wrong was growing stronger, though it remained faint, like smoke seeping through cracks. By the time he returned to the Quai de la Tournelle, evening was creeping in again. The fog had thickened once more, and lights glowed dully along the river. He paused on the embankment, staring at the slow black water. Somewhere behind him, in that pale blue house, a widow sat alone, waiting, not for him, but for the return of the man whose presence she both tolerated and feared, and Maigret knew he would be waiting as well. Not with impatience, not with demands, but with the quiet certainty that sooner or later the truth would show itself, in a gesture, in a silence, in the way an ordinary life betrayed the weight of something concealed. The fog thickened as the night settled once more over the harbour, wrapping the quay in a damp stillness that seemed to smother sound. Maigret lingered near the embankment, his coat collar turned up, pipe clenched unlit between his teeth. He had no reason to remain there officially. No crime had yet been declared, no warrant issued. But he felt the pull of the place, as if something invisible threaded itself between the pale blue door of the widow's apartment and the restless water of the Seine. After some time he drifted back toward the narrow street, his heavy steps muffled by the fog. He did not go straight inside, but stood across the way beneath the dim glow of a lamp, watching. Windows in the building showed no movement. Now and then a passerby appeared out of the mist, a dock worker hurrying home, a pair of students laughing softly, their figures swallowed again by the white veil. It was close to 10 when the sound of footsteps approached, measured, deliberate. A tall figure emerged from the fog, shoulders hunched in a heavy coat. He paused before the blue door, searched his pocket for a key, then let himself inside. Maigret could not see his face clearly, but the silhouette matched what he had expected. The boarder Le Guen Maigret waited a few moments longer, then crossed the street and mounted the steps. He knocked, not loudly, and was answered after a pause by the widow herself. She looked surprised to see him, more so when he explained that he had seen her lodger return and wished a word. Her eyes darted briefly toward the corridor, then back. To him, uncertainty plain in her expression. "Of course," she murmured, though her voice carried reluctance. She led him down the narrow passage and knocked once on the final door before opening it without waiting for a reply. The room was as Maigret had left it earlier, yet now it was alive with its occupant. Le Guin sat at the table, a cigarette burning in his fingers, his jacket still on. He looked up with calm eyes, neither startled nor defensive. His features were sharp, his mouth drawn tight in a way that suggested habit rather than mood. "Inspector," he said as though expecting him. His voice was low even, carrying the trace of a Breton accent. "I was in the neighborhood," Maigret replied mildly, lowering himself into the single empty chair. "Thought I might say good evening." Le Guin gave a faint smile, one that revealed nothing. "You police have strange notions of social calls." "Sometimes," Maigret allowed, filling his pipe with slow care. "You work the docks?" The man shrugged. "Here and there, when there's work. Barges, sometimes warehouses, depends on the day." His answers were neither evasive nor forthcoming, offered in the same flat tone as one might recite the weather. Maigret studied him quietly, the weight of his gaze steady. He was accustomed to the discomfort silence could produce, but Le Guin seemed immune to it. He smoked, flicked ash into a saucer, and met the inspector's eyes without shifting. "You've been lodging here long?" "Months now. I pay regularly." "Madame can confirm that." She did. Maigret struck a match, lit his pipe and let the smoke curl between them. "She also said you keep odd hours." Le Guin gave another small shrug. "Odd hours for odd work." The widow stood just inside the doorway, her hands twisting together. Maigret glanced at her briefly, enough to make her shift uneasily, then turned back to the border. "You have family here in Paris?" "No. Friends. None worth speaking of." The words hung in the air, neither defiant nor ashamed, only flat. A man without ties, without roots, existing in a room that looked as though it had been borrowed rather than lived in. Maigret puffed his pipe slowly. "And last night, where were you?" Le Guin stubbed out his cigarette and lit another, the Pole. Motion calm, deliberate. "Working." "Which dock?" The faintest hesitation, barely a breath. "Saint Bernard." "Bernard." Maigret nodded, though he knew the pause meant more than the answer itself. He did not press further. Instead he rose, his large frame filling the small space. "I'll let you rest. Good night, Monsieur Le Guin." The man inclined his head, in acknowledgement, as if they had simply exchanged pleasantries. In the corridor, Maigret paused. The widow followed him, whispering once they were out of earshot. "You see, he answers politely, but there's something about him, as though he hides a weight inside." Maigret looked at her closely. "And you, madame, what is it you hide?" She blinked rapidly, startled. "Me?" "You were not merely uneasy with him, you were uneasy with yourself." Her lips parted, but no reply came. She lowered her gaze, pressing a hand to her mouth as though to stifle words. Maigret did not wait for an answer. He simply touched the brim of his hat and left. Back on the quay, the fog clung heavier, beading on his coat, dampening his hat brim. He walked slowly toward the embankment, pipe smoke mingling with the mist. The image of Le Guin remained fixed in his mind, calm, impenetrable, a man who gave nothing away yet seemed to know the measure of those around him. And the widow, restless, fragile, her silence broken only by sudden confessions that revealed more than she intended. At a café near the Pont de Sully, Maigret sat with a small glass of brandy. He drank it slowly, thinking of the countless rooms he had entered in his career, each carrying its own odor of lives half-lived and secrets poorly kept. This one was no different, and yet he felt the pull of it more strongly than usual, as though beneath the still surface of those two lives, widow and boarder alike, something had begun to stir. When he returned home at last, well past midnight, Madame Maigret was again waiting with her knitting. She looked at him with her quiet, steady eyes. "Long day?" she asked simply. He nodded, easing into his chair. "And it will be longer still." She set her work aside, poured him a cup of coffee, though the hour was late. As he drank, she said, not as a question, but as an observation, "You don't trust him?" "No," Maigret admitted softly, "but it is not him alone. It is the silence between them that troubles me most." He sat with the thought long after she had gone to bed, the fog pressing at the windows. the city's muted heartbeat throbbing faintly through the night. Somewhere, in that silence, lay the truth. He only had to wait for it to show itself. The morning rain washed away some of the fog, but left the streets slick, the air heavy with damp coal smoke. Maigret arrived at the Quai de la Tournelle earlier than usual, his hat low against the drizzle, his mind already turning over the images of the night before. He had seen men like Jules Le Guen before, solitary, self-contained, neither aggressive nor ingratiating. They were men who drifted along the edges of society, careful to reveal little, never quite belonging. Yet there had been something else, something he could not yet name in the way the widow had whispered her unease, after Le Guen closed his door. Inside the building, the narrow stair smelled of damp stone and stale cooking. The widow answered his knock almost at once, as though she had been waiting near the door. Her coat was buttoned, her scarf wrapped tightly again, as though she meant to go out but had stopped herself. "You're early," she said, with a faint attempt at a smile. "So, are you?" Maigret replied, stepping inside. He removed his hat, shook the rain from it, and stood a moment listening. The apartment was too quiet. No sound came from the corridor where Le Guen's room lay. "He went out just before dawn," she said, following his glance. "I heard. The door. You didn't see him?" She shook her head. "I don't go to the corridor when he passes." Maigret lowered himself into the chair by the window. The widow hovered near the table, restless, her hands forever in motion. He filled his pipe slowly, deliberately, giving her the comfort of silence. It was always in the silence that words came. At last she said, "You think I'm foolish, don't you, an old woman letting shadows frighten her?" "Not foolish," Maigret said, striking a match. The flame lit his face briefly before the smoke curled between them. "But you're not only frightened. You're guilty of something too, madame. The trouble is, I don't know what." Her breath caught. She gripped the back of the chair before her, her knuckles whitening. "I've done nothing," he exhaled, watching her through the smoke. "Then it will be easier to sit with me a while. And tell me what you remember." What followed was not a confession, but fragments offered hesitantly. Henri Serre, her late husband, had worked with the customs office, posted often near the river. He had died suddenly, 2 winters past, of pneumonia. Since then, the widow had let the upstairs room to supplement her pension. Le Guen had arrived with a letter from a distant cousin. Though she admitted now she had never checked the connection, he paid in cash, spoke little, but from the beginning she had felt the unease of someone living with a stranger, in too small her house. "And yet you kept him," Maigret said quietly. Her eyes filled briefly, though no tears fell. It was easier than being alone. The words hung heavy in the room. Loneliness, he thought, was often the soil from which deeper troubles grew. By mid-morning, Maigret left the house, letting the widow retreat into her silence once more. He walked toward the docks at Saint-Bernard, where Le Guen had claimed to be working. The drizzle thickened into rain, beating softly on the warehouse roofs. He questioned stevedores and warehouse clerks, men who gave their answers with the bluntness of those too busy to waste time. Some recognized the name Le Guen, some the description. Yes, he had worked a shift weeks ago. Yes, he sometimes showed up, but not regular, not steady. A man who appeared when needed, vanished when not. One man, a wiry fellow with scarred hands, leaned against a crate and spat into the rain. That one? Keeps his eyes open too much. Not like a worker. More like he's always listening for something. Don't trust men who listen too much. Maigret absorbed the remark with a slight nod. He walked further along the quay, stopping at a barge moored near the bridge. Its captain, a broad-shouldered man with a red scarf, shrugged when asked. Le Guen? Maybe. Hard to keep track. Faces come and go. He doesn't drink with the rest of us, if that tells you anything. The inspector returned to the widow's neighborhood by afternoon, his boots damp, his pipe empty. He entered the cafe across from her house, ordering a beer he barely touched. Through the window, blurred by rain streaks, he could see the pale blue door. He sat for nearly an hour, waiting, watching, letting the rhythms of the street pass before him. At last the door opened. Le Guen emerged, coat collar up, moving with the same deliberate stride as the night before. He turned toward the embankment, not hurried, but purposeful. Maigret left coins on the counter and followed, keeping his distance. The man walked along the quay, past the moored barges, past shuttered warehouses. He stopped once to light a cigarette, cupping the match from the rain, then continued until he reached a small riverside tavern. Inside, the light was dim, the air thick with smoke and wet wool. Maigret entered a few moments later, settling himself at the bar. Le Guin sat alone at a corner table, a glass before him untouched. He smoked, watching the door, watching the room, yet never seeming to fix his gaze on anything. He did not greet anyone, and no one greeted him. He sat as a man apart, present but detached. Maigret nursed his beer, saying nothing. Time passed in the slow way it did in such places, with the rain pattering on the roof and the occasional burst of laughter from the boatmen. Le Guin finished his cigarette, drained his glass in a single swallow, and rose. Maigret followed again as he left, noting the direction, the pace. The man did not return to the widow's house, but continued deeper into the warren of streets near the docks. There he disappeared into a building that looked half abandoned, its shutters broken, its door sagging on its hinges. Maigret did not enter. He stood across the street, pipe stem resting against his teeth, and waited. Rainwater dripped from his hat brim, ran down the collar of his coat, but he did not move. Waiting was his craft. After nearly an hour, Le Guin re-emerged. He looked neither hurried nor guilty, only steady, as though his business were done. He turned back toward the quay, toward the pale blue house where the widow waited. Maigret lit his pipe at last, the match flaring against the rain. He had no answers yet, only more questions, but he felt the shape of something forming in the silence between widow and boarder, in the long walks through fog and rain, in the rooms that smelled more of absence than of life. And as he followed, slowly at a distance, he knew he would not leave the harbour quarter until that silence had broken. The next day began with a grey sky that hung low over the river, the kind of sky that seemed to press the streets flatter, muffling even the sound of cartwheels on whetstones. Maigret left his office at the Quai des Orfèvres later than usual. He had no official summons to return to the widow's harbour quarter, no directive from a superior, yet the weight of the place drew him back. Cases seldom began with official orders. They began with unease. He walked at a steady pace, pipe clenched over the Pont de Sully toward the embankment. Barges still moved sluggishly along the water, their captains bundled in oilskins. The tavern from the night before was shuttered, but across the street a grocer's shop had opened its blinds. Maigret paused there, purchasing an apple he didn't intend to eat, listening to the chatter of the grocer's wife with a customer. No mention of Le Guin, no mention of the widow. The neighborhood seemed unaware of the quiet tension in that pale blue house. By the time he reached it, he found the widow waiting at her window as if she had anticipated his arrival. She opened the door before he knocked, ushering him inside with a look that seemed equal parts relief and fear. "He hasn't returned," she whispered. "He left you last night?" Her nod was sharp, anxious. "I heard him come in, but only briefly. Then the door again. I haven't seen him since." Maigret moved to the chair by the window and sat without removing his coat. The air inside was cooler than the damp street outside, the silence thick. He let her pace before him, her words tumbling in nervous fragments. "He doesn't work. He pretends, but I hear his steps at all hours. He comes and goes when no one is looking. Sometimes I think he watches me in my sleep. I wake, and I feel it." The inspector did not interrupt. He tamped his pipe, struck a match, and inhaled. Smoke gathered in the corners like a second fog. "Did your husband know him?" he asked at last. The widow stopped pacing. Her eyes flicked toward the corridor, as though fearing Le Guin might emerge at the mention. "No. Henri had nothing to do with him. Never." It was too quick, too certain. He said nothing, only watched her until she began to fidget again. People often betrayed themselves more through what they insisted upon than what they denied. When he left, it was with the sense of carrying two shadows instead of one, the widow's and Le Guin's, and neither cast clearly. He walked once more toward the abandoned building where Le Guin had vanished the night before. In daylight it looked even more derelict, with plaster flaking from the walls and shutters dangling like broken limbs. He pushed the door gently, and to his surprise it yielded with a groan. Inside, dust thickened the air, but the floor bore fresh scuff marks. He followed them across a narrow hallway into a room with a single stool, a chipped enamel basin, and cigarette butts crushed into the floorboards. Someone had been here recently, and often. The room smelled faintly of tobacco and damp wool, but also of something sharper, metallic, ink or oil. On the stool lay a folded scrap of newspaper, the headline only half visible, a shipping schedule, last week's date. He pocketed it and left, closing the door softly behind him. He didn't return directly to the pale blue house. Instead, he stopped at the tavern by the quay. The captain with the red scarf was there again, nursing a morning drink. When Maigret asked casually if he'd seen Le Guin, the man shrugged. That one? He drifts, he listens, he waits. Men who wait usually want something, Inspector. Maigret left coins on the counter and resumed his slow walk, waiting. It was a word that clung to Le Guin like a second skin, but waiting for what? For whom? The widow's street was busier now, children darting between puddles, women shaking, rugs from upstairs windows. Maigret lingered outside the grocer's, lighting his pipe. From across the way he saw the pale blue door open. Le Guin had returned. The man emerged with his coat buttoned, his hat low, his pace unhurried. He looked neither at Maigret nor at anyone else. He simply moved like a shadow detached from its source. This time Maigret followed closer. They walked along the quay, past barges unloading crates, past a policeman dozing beneath an archway. At length, Le Guin turned into a narrow lane where the cobblestones were uneven, and the walls damp with moss. There he stopped, not to enter, not to smoke, but to stand. He remained still for several minutes as though listening. Then, abruptly, he retraced his steps. Maigret did not approach him. He returned instead to the widow's apartment. She was at the window again, watching. He was here, she asked breathlessly. He was, she clutched the back of a chair, trembling. He frightens me, Inspector. Not because of what he does, but because of what he doesn't. He never loses his temper, never raises his voice. But I feel he's waiting for me to make a mistake. Maigret nodded slowly, studying her drawn face. It was not Le Guin alone who troubled him now. It was the widow herself, her anticipation, her fear sharpened by something unspoken. "Tell me about your husband again," he said quietly. Her eyes widened, then lowered. "Henri was good. He worked hard. He died of pneumonia, I told you." "Yes. You told me." But her voice had caught again in that same too certain tone. Maigret leaned back, pipe smoke curling toward the ceiling. He did not press further, not yet. Pressure only hardened silence. Instead, he let the room settle, the rain resume its soft drumming against the glass. When he finally rose to leave, the widow seemed smaller somehow, as though she had been drained by her own fear. Outside, the fog had begun to creep back from the river, wrapping the street in pale gauze. Maigret stood beneath the overhang of a shuttered shop, his collar raised, watching the pale blue door across the way. He waited, as Le Guin waited. He listened, as the widow listened. And though the harbour quarter seemed as ordinary as ever, with children's voices and the smell of fried onions drifting from kitchens, he knew the silence between the widow and her boarder would not hold much longer. Something had to break, whether through confession, through collapse, or through the faintest slip of words left unguarded. Maigret lit another match, cupped it against the damp wind, and thought it would not be long now. The fog thickened as evening fell, rising from the Seine in soft, shifting waves that blurred the outlines of the barges and swallowed the lamps one by one. Maigret remained at his post across from the pale blue house, his pipe long extinguished, his broad figure barely distinguishable beneath the awning of the shuttered shop. Hours had slipped by without movement, yet his patience was untroubled. He had spent many nights in such waiting, and the harbour quarter offered its own companionship, the muffled slap of water against stone, the far-off clatter of crates being unloaded, the hiss of rain turning fine as mist. At last the widow's door creaked open. Le Guin stepped out as composed as ever, his coat buttoned high, his hat pulled low. He carried nothing in his hands, and yet Maigret sensed the weight of something unseen in his manner. The man paused on the threshold, as though listening to the fog itself, then set off toward the embankment. Maigret followed at a measured distance. They moved along the deserted quay, their steps softened by the mist. Once Le Guin paused at the river's edge, peering into the dark water where reflections wavered, then resumed walking without a sound. He turned into the narrow street where Maigret had trailed him before, the one lined with damp walls and crooked cobblestones. This time he did not stop midway. He entered the same derelict building. Maigret waited a long minute before approaching. He stood just beyond the door, listening. Inside, faint noises carried, the scrape of wood, the faint clink of glass, a chair shifting across the floor. Carefully, he pushed the door ajar. The interior was dim, the air heavy with the smell of damp plaster and stale smoke. He could see the faint orange glow of a cigarette deep within the corridor, where Le Guin must have settled into that barren room. The inspector did not enter further. He withdrew quietly, letting the door close again, with barely a whisper. Some truths revealed themselves not by being forced, but by being allowed to ripen in their own silence. He returned to the street, retracing his steps toward the widow's house. She was at her window again when he approached, her pale face framed by the yellow glow of the lamp. She hurried to the door at his knock, as if she had been waiting in fear for his return. "You followed him?" she whispered, pulling him inside. "Yes." "And?" "He waits," Maigret said simply. The words seemed to chill her more than any long explanation. She sat heavily in a chair, her hands trembling in her lap. "What is he waiting for?" she asked, almost to herself. Maigret lit his pipe, watching the match flare against the dimness of the room. He did not answer. Instead, he asked, "Tell me about Henri again. Not about his work, not about his death. Tell me about the months before he died." The widow's eyes flickered. She rose abruptly, crossing to the sideboard as if to busy herself. "I've told you already. He was often ill. He coughed, But he worked," Maigret interrupted quietly. "At the customs office along the river. Did he ever mention a man like Le Guin?" She froze with her hand on the sideboard. "No." The denial was swift, sharp, and once again too certain. Too certain. Maigret allowed silence to stretch. He drew on his pipe, the smoke drifting between them. At last she turned back, her face pinched with strain. "You don't understand," she said hoarsely. "When Henri died, everything changed. I was left with nothing but this house, nothing but debts. I needed someone to fill the room, someone to help me keep the place. I didn't ask questions, I didn't want to know." Her words spilled quickly, almost desperately, yet Maigret sensed they concealed as much as they revealed. He leaned back, eyes half closed, listening more to the tone than the meaning. Fear, yes, but not only fear of Le Guin, fear of something that bound them both. The hour grew late. He left her then, returning to the quay where the fog thickened, swallowing the outlines of the houses. He lingered once more outside the derelict building. It remained silent now, its windows blind, its door shut. On his way back toward the bridge, he stopped at the tavern. The captain in the red scarf was still there, his glass half empty. At Maigret's quiet questions, he leaned forward, lowering his voice. "There was talk 2 winters back," he said. "A man from the customs office died sudden. Not just pneumonia, some said. There was trouble with shipments, contraband slipping through. Names were whispered, but nothing proved. Since then, strangers sometimes come looking, listening. Your man Le Guin, he has the look of one of them. Not a worker, not a neighbor, a man sent to watch." Maigret thanked him with a nod, left coins, and returned into the fog. The puzzle turned slowly in his mind. A husband dead, a widow frightened, a boarder who listened more than he spoke, who lingered in empty buildings and carried no visible trade. Something tied them together, though the thread remained hidden. As he neared the pale blue house once more, he saw movement at the window. The widow stood there again, her face pale against the glass, her gaze fixed on the street, as though she expected danger to step from the fog at any moment. Maigret paused beneath the lamp across the way. He struck a match, lit his pipe, and let the glow linger before his face. He made no attempt to conceal his presence. It was sometimes enough to remind people they were seen, that their secrets did not remain entirely their own. The widow drew back quickly from the window, the lamp inside flickering as though she had hastily turned it low. The street fell silent again, the fog pressing close. Maigret stood there a long while, smoking in the damp air, his heavy frame outlined faintly by the mist. He did not yet know whose silence would break first, the widow's or Le Guen's, but he knew it would be soon. The harbour, with its shifting fog and half-lit rooms, could not keep its secrets much longer. By the following morning, the fog had lifted, though the air along the harbour remained heavy with damp, as if the night's unease had seeped into the stones themselves. Maigret rose early, not because duty called him, but because the silence of the widow's pale blue house lingered in his thoughts like a tune he could not forget. He ate his breakfast with Madame Maigret in silence, listening absently as she spoke of errands to be done, of a neighbour who had fallen ill. At one point she remarked almost idly, "A house with 2 people who don't speak. It must be heavier than a house with 10. He gave her a brief glance, then returned to his coffee, the words resting in his mind as though they had been spoken for his investigation alone. When he reached the harbour quarter again, the streets were already stirring. Stevedores were unloading. Crates a vendor was shouting prices for cabbages, and the tavern door stood open to let out the smell of stale beer. The pale blue house, by contrast, seemed sealed off from the life around it. Its shutters were drawn, its door closed, its silence complete. Maigret crossed the street and knocked. It was some time before the widow answered, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed as if she had not slept. She opened the door only a little, and her voice came in a whisper. "He didn't come back last night. Are you certain?" She nodded. "I sat in the chair by the door. I would have heard him." Maigret studied her a moment, then stepped, inside uninvited. The apartment smelled of cold ashes and damp wool. He set his hat on the table and sat heavily in the chair by the window. The widow remained standing, wringing her hands as though torn between wanting him there and fearing what his presence meant. "You're relieved," he said at last, his voice quiet. She started. "Relieved?" "Yes. You'd have me believe. You're only frightened. But if he doesn't return your lighter, and yet," he drew on his pipe, "there's also guilt in you. You'd miss him, though you don't admit it." Her lips trembled. She lowered her gaze. "You don't understand. It's not him I'd miss, it's the silence." The silence was terrible, but it was something to fill the emptiness. "Alone, the house will feel like a grave." Her words struck him as truer than any denial she had given. He left her then with only a nod, stepping back into the busy street. His next stop was the derelict building where Le Guen had taken refuge. He entered more boldly this time, sunlight cutting slants through the broken shutters. The stool was still there, the basin, the cigarette butts. On the floor he found a matchbox stamped with the name of a tavern upriver, one Maigret knew was frequented by bargemen with less lawful cargo. He slipped it into his pocket, his expression unreadable. By midday he was back at the tavern with the red-scarfed captain, who greeted him with the weary patience of a man who had expected the inspector's return. "You'll not find him here. Today," the captain muttered before Maigret even spoke. "Where then?" The man shrugged. "Up the river, down the river. Men like him keep moving. Some say he listens for the wrong people. Others say he carries messages. Who can tell?" Maigret bought him a drink, then another, though the man revealed little more. He left before the liquor dulled the conversation, his pipe clenched between his teeth, the matchbox in his pocket reminding him of the thread he had begun to follow. When evening fell once more, Maigret stationed himself again across from the widow's house. This time the shutters opened just after the lamps were lit, and the widow leaned out, scanning the street. Her face, half in shadow, bore a look that was neither fear nor expectation, but resignation. Le Guen returned at last, walking out of the fog as though he had been shaped by it. His stride was the same, steady, deliberate. He carried no bag, no parcel, yet his coat bulged slightly at one pocket. He did not glance at Maigret, though the inspector made no effort to hide. He simply entered the pale blue house, the door closing behind him with its familiar creak. The light in the window glowed for a time, then dimmed. Maigret remained outside, smoking, the fog coiling around his broad figure. What bound them together? The widow, her dead husband, the silent boarder who waited and watched. It was not chance, not coincidence. He felt it in the rhythm of their unease, in the way she looked both for him and away from him, in the way he vanished yet always returned. Patience, Maigret thought. The silence would not hold. It never did. He left his post only after midnight, when the street was empty and the fog pressed close against the houses. As he crossed the bridge back toward the heart of the city, the matchbox in his pocket felt heavier than before, as if it carried not just a clue, but the shape of the truth waiting to emerge. In the quiet of his office the next morning, with the river fog still clinging to his coat, he laid the matchbox on his desk. A small, ordinary object, yet it seemed to him more eloquent than any testimony he had gathered. It belonged not to the widow, not to her house, but to the wider net of the river's trade, smuggling, secrets, men who came and went like shadows. Le Guin was not a boarder by chance. He was tied to something that had touched Henri Serre before his sudden death, and Maigret, filling his pipe once more, knew he was drawing closer to the point where silence would break, where someone, widow or boarder, would falter beneath the weight of what lay unspoken. He rose, slipping the matchbox into his pocket, and turned toward the window where the Seine rolled sluggish and grey. He would return to the harbour quarter that afternoon. He would wait, as he always did, and he would listen, not to words, but to the silences that grew heavier with each passing day. The fog did not return that day, though the air remained heavy with the smell of coal smoke and damp wood. Maigret reached the harbour quarter in the late afternoon, walking without hurry, his hat low, his pipe stem resting against his teeth. He stopped at the tavern first, not because he expected to find Le Guin there, but because it was in such places that talk travelled. The barman, polishing glasses without enthusiasm, confirmed with a shrug that Le Guin had not been seen since the night before. The absence did not surprise Maigret. Absence, like silence, was part of the man's pattern. He crossed the street and lingered by the river's edge, watching the barges shift with the current. One of the captains called out to him, recognizing him now as a fixture of the quarter, but Maigret only lifted a hand in reply. His eyes drifted back to the pale blue house. The shutters were half drawn, the lamp inside already lit, though the evening was still young. When he knocked, the widow opened the door at once. She had not been waiting at the window, but the speed of her response told him she had been hovering near the entrance, listening for his step. Her face was drawn, her hair hastily pinned, her body wrapped in a shawl that slipped from one shoulder. She let him in with a motion that was almost desperate. "He's upstairs," she whispered, as though afraid Le Guin might hear through the walls. "He came back early this morning. He's hardly left his room since." Maigret set his hat on the table and sat in his usual chair, filling the space with his calm presence. He lit his pipe slowly, letting the silence stretch until her hands began to tremble around the shawl. "You're keeping something from me," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. Her lips parted, but no words came. She sat opposite him, her eyes fixed on the floorboards, as though the truth were written there, but she dared not read it aloud. At last she murmured, "I don't want to remember. That's all." He exhaled a plume of smoke, watching her through the haze. "But you do remember. Every moment. You've carried it alone, waiting for someone to ask the right question." Her head lifted and her eyes, dark with exhaustion, met his. "It wasn't pneumonia," she whispered. "Henri. He was found by the river, cold, already gone. They said pneumonia because it was easier. But I knew. He had been mixed up in something. He never told me, but I saw it in his face those last weeks. Fear. He was a man afraid of shadows. And then he was gone." The words left her lips in a rush, as though they had been waiting at the threshold for months, perhaps years. Maigret listened without interrupting, his pipe forgotten in his hand. "And Le Guin?" he asked at last. She shivered. "He came soon after. Too soon. He knew details he shouldn't have, about Henri's hours, about his habits. He never said anything. Outright, but I felt it. As if he were waiting for me to speak, to admit something. I don't know what he wants. Sometimes I think he's here to protect me. Other times, to accuse me. The inspector leaned back, letting the smoke curl upward. Protection or accusation, it hardly mattered. What mattered was that the widow lived in a house where her past had returned in the form of a silent boarder. Did Henri know him? Maigret pressed gently. I don't know. Perhaps. I never asked. Henri never spoke of his work. Footsteps sounded in the corridor then, slow and deliberate. Both turned their heads. Le Guen appeared in the doorway, his face expressionless, his hat in his hand as if he meant to step out. For a moment, the three of them remained frozen in the narrow room, the tension thicker than the fog had ever been. Maigret did not rise. He only regarded the man steadily, his broad frame relaxed, but his eyes sharp. You spend much time in empty houses, Le Guen, he said softly. Why? Le Guen's gaze flickered, the faintest trace of a smile at the corners of his lips. Some houses are less empty than they seem, Inspector. He turned without another word and left, the door closing behind him with its familiar creak. The widow sagged in her chair, her shawl slipping entirely to the floor. You see? He knows. He knows about Henri. Maigret rose, placed his hat back on his head, and touched her shoulder gently as he passed. He knows something, but it is not always the same as knowing the truth. Outside, the street was quiet, the lamps glowing dimly through the early dusk. Maigret followed Le Guen's trail down to the quay, though he kept his distance. The man walked with the same steady pace, pausing now and then as though attuned to sounds no one else heard. At length he reached the derelict building again and disappeared inside. This time Maigret entered after him. The room was dim, the stool and basin still in place, the cigarette butts scattered. Le Guen sat by the window smoking, his gaze fixed on the river. He did not startle at Maigret's arrival. He merely exhaled and said, It wasn't your widow who betrayed him, you know. It was his own fear. Men who fear too much invite their end. And you? Maigret asked calmly. I was sent to watch. To wait. Nothing more. Henri Serre made his choices long before I arrived. The words carried neither menace nor absolution, only the weary resignation of a man accustomed to shadows. Maigret regarded him a long moment, then left him there, the glow of his cigarette fading against the grey light. Back at the pale blue house, the widow stood again at her window, waiting. When she saw Maigret return alone, she seemed to understand, without words, that the truth had surfaced, though no confession had been made. Later that night, Maigret sat at a small table in a café by the river, a glass of beer before him. The fog had begun to roll in again, blurring the lights across the water. He thought of Henri Serre, of the fear that had consumed him, of the widow who carried both grief and guilt, of the silent boarder who waited not for violence but for time to finish its work. There would be no dramatic arrests, no headlines, only a widow who could finally sleep without listening for footsteps in the corridor, and a man like Le Guen who would drift on to another harbour, another silence. Maigret drank. Slowly, set down his glass and listened to the rain begin once more against the cobblestones. Human lives, he thought, were like the river itself, sometimes sluggish, sometimes swift, always carrying with them the silt of unspoken truths, and in the end it was enough simply to watch, to listen, and to understand. The following morning arrived with a pale drizzle that seemed to wash the streets clean of the previous night's fog. Maigret lingered in his office longer than usual, the window cracked open to let in the damp smell of stone and coal smoke. He had not written a report, nor would he. There was little to put in writing, and less still that his superiors would care to hear. Deaths recorded as pneumonia did not invite fresh inquiries, yet the story had come to rest in his mind, piece by quiet piece. Henri Serre had not been killed by violence, not directly. He had been undone by a slow tightening of fear, by the invisible pressure of debts, threats, and secrets whispered along the docks. It was the sort of death that left no obvious wound, and so the city had turned its face away, content to call it illness. Maigret rose at last and walked to the harbour one final time. The widow's house stood as it always had, pale and quiet, its shutters closed against the damp morning. She met him at the door, less anxious now, her shawl properly in place, her movements steady. "You won't be coming back?" she asked. A question more than a statement. Maigret shook his head. "There's no need, he's gone." She nodded, her expression unreadable, though her shoulders seemed lighter. For the first time, she did not look over her shoulder toward the staircase. The silence of her house would now be her own, no longer shaped by another man's presence. He left her there and turned toward the quay. Le Guen was already gone. The stool and cigarette butts had been cleared away. The derelict building stood empty, echoing faintly with the sound of dripping water. Such men, Maigret thought, never stayed long. They lived in the margins, leaving behind nothing more than an impression, a suspicion, and a wisp of smoke. At the cafe by the water, he ordered a beer and let the hours slip by. He did not try to force the story into neat compartments. It had never been neat. Henri Serre had been an ordinary man, caught between petty smuggling schemes and his own inability to bear their weight. The widow had endured his silence and then endured his death. And Le Guen, whoever he truly was, had come not to punish or avenge, but simply to watch, to ensure nothing more would come of it. There was no villain, not in the way people like to imagine. There was only fear, loneliness, and the heavy air of the harbor pressing on fragile souls. When his glass was empty, Maigret paid and stepped back into the drizzle. The streets were busy again, barges unloading, children running, the ordinary rhythm of life returning without regard for one man's end. He lit his pipe, the smoke curling upward into the damp air, and stood for a long moment watching the river slide by, indifferent, eternal. Then he turned up his collar, tucked his hands in his pockets, and walked slowly back toward the Quai des Orfèvres. Another case would come, another story written in silence and small betrayals, but this one was finished, carried away by the river and the fog, and Maigret, as always, understood. Understood.